My boyfriend let his new little sister submit an application to transfer me hundreds of miles away. He called it a prank. I called it a reason to leave. So I packed my bags, boarded the plane, and started a new life without him in it. He called it a prank. That was the word Mark used, his voice thin and reedy over the phone, stretched across 300 miles of static and disbelief. A prank. His 15-year-old stepsister, Chloe, a girl I'd met a grand total of 3 times, had found my work laptop unlocked. She'd gone into my company's internal transfer portal, filled out an application for a position in a desolate branch office in North Dakota, and submitted it. My manager, thinking I was showing initiative, had approved it within the hour. By the time I found out, the wheels were already turning. My job, my life, my future with Mark, it was all being shipped to a state I'd only ever seen on a weather map. A prank. I remember staring at the peeling paint on my apartment wall, the phone feeling cold and heavy in my hand, and all I could think was that the word prank had never sounded so much like an excuse. It sounded like a get-out-of-jail-free card for cowardice. Babe, you have to admit, it's a little funny, he'd said, trying to laugh it off. The laugh was hollow, a desperate sound. I mean, North Dakota? Who even moves to North Dakota? I didn't answer. I was too busy thinking about Chloe's smirk the last time I'd seen her, a look of smug satisfaction that had seemed out of place on a teenager. I'd chalked it up to adolescent angst. Now, it felt like a declaration of war. She didn't like me. That much was obvious. I was the woman who had taken her brother's attention, the one who wasn't her mother. Her father, Mark's dad, had remarried a few years ago, and Chloe was the product of that second union, a late-in-life surprise who had grown up coddled and territorial. She saw me as an intruder in her carefully constructed family unit, and Mark, my Mark, the man I loved, had stood by and let her light the match. Did you watch her do it? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. A pause. That was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't think she'd actually hit send, Amelia, he stammered. She was just clicking around. It was a joke. I told her to stop. But you didn't make her stop, I said. The statement hung in the air between us, heavy and irrefutable. He hadn't intervened. He had watched this child, this stranger, play with my life like it was a dollhouse, and he had done nothing. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose not to upset his stepsister, not to cause a scene, not to stand up for me. In that moment of inaction, he had made his choice, and in doing so, he had made mine for me. I'm going to Human Resources tomorrow, I said, my tone flat, devoid of the hysteria that was churning in my gut. I'll see if they can reverse it. Yeah, exactly, he said, latching onto the hope, his relief palpable. You can fix this. It's just a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment of absolute, blinding clarity. I saw the future laid out before me, a lifetime of being second place to his family's whims, of my boundaries being treated as suggestions, of my feelings being dismissed as overreactions, a lifetime of being the butt of a joke I wasn't in on. The next day, I went to Human Resources. Brenda, a woman with a kind face and tired eyes, listened patiently. She pulled up the file. The transfer was not only approved, but my position in the city had already been filled. The company was restructuring, and my proactive request had been a godsend for them. They'd been looking to downsize the urban office and bolster the rural ones. My prank had solved a logistical problem for them. They could reverse it, she explained, but it would be messy. I'd have to file a formal complaint against a coworker for unauthorized system access, a coworker who happened to be my boyfriend's teenage sister. It would involve his family, lawyers, and a lot of bad blood. The other option was to take the transfer. They were even offering a relocation bonus. I looked at Brenda, at the file on her screen with my name on it, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of inevitability. This wasn't a prank that had gone wrong. This was a door that had been opened. That night, I didn't call Mark. I went home and I started to pack. Not everything, just the essentials, my clothes, my books, the photos of my own family, my grandmother's locket. I left behind the coffee maker he'd given me, the oversized armchair we'd bought together, the framed photo of us on the beach. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and a handful of boxes. As I worked, I felt a grief so profound it was almost physical, a hollowness in my chest where the last 4 years of my life had been. But underneath the grief, there was something else, a tiny, flickering flame of defiance. Chloe wanted me gone. Mark had allowed it. The universe, in its own cruel and bureaucratic way, had facilitated it. Fine, they would get what they wanted. I would go, but I wouldn't be going for them. I wouldn't be going as the victim of a childish prank. I would be going for me. I was accepting a transfer not just to North Dakota, but away from a life where I was considered disposable. I booked a one-way flight. I arranged for my boxes to be shipped. I wrote a resignation letter to a job I once loved, and a Dear John letter to a man I thought I would marry. I left his letter on the kitchen counter, next to his favorite mug. It was short. Mark, it said, you were right. It is kind of funny. They're even paying me a bonus to leave. I hope you and Chloe have a good laugh about it. Goodbye, Amelia. I called a cab to the airport 2 hours before my flight. As the city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, my phone buzzed incessantly. Mark, his father, his stepmother. I silenced it and dropped it into my purse. The calls were just noise now. The decision was made. The plane was waiting. I was being transferred. It wasn't a prank. It was an escape. And as the plane lifted off the runway, leaving the sprawling city lights behind for the vast, dark unknown of the plains, I didn't feel scared. I felt free. The town of Prairie Ridge, North Dakota, was exactly what it sounded like. It was a small cluster of buildings huddled against an endless expanse of sky and earth. The wind was a constant presence, a low moan that seemed to carry the loneliness of the landscape right into your bones. My new office was in a 2-story brick building on Main Street, which was also the only street of any real consequence. My apartment was a small 1-bedroom above the town's only diner. From my window, I could see fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, their golden heads bowing in the relentless wind. The first few weeks weeks were a blur of disorientation and paperwork. The job was fine. It was the same work I'd done in the city, just with fewer people and a much slower pace. My new colleagues were polite but distant. They were mostly locals who had known each other their whole lives, and I was an outsider, a city girl dropped into their midst by some corporate whim. They didn't know the story, and I didn't offer it. I was just Amelia from the head office, here to help streamline their data entry processes. Loneliness was a physical entity. It sat with me at dinner. It lay beside me in bed. It was my passenger in the car as I drove down long, empty highways just to feel like I was going somewhere. The silence was the hardest part. In the city, there was always noise, a constant hum of life that filled the empty spaces. Here, the silence was vast and profound. It forced me to listen to the cacophony in my own head. The anger came first. A hot, searing rage at Mark for his weakness, at Chloe for her malice, at myself for not seeing it sooner. I would pace my small apartment, replaying our last conversation, imagining all the things I should have said, the insults I should have hurled. I composed furious, scathing emails in my head, letters that would flay him with their brutal honesty, but I never sent them. What was the point? He'd already shown me who he was. Then came the grief. It arrived like a thief in the night, stealing my breath and leaving me hollowed out. I missed him. I missed the man I thought he was. I missed our Sunday mornings with the crossword puzzle, the way he'd hum off key while he cooked, the feeling of his hand in mine. I cried for the future we were supposed to have, the children we'd planned, the life we'd built that had turned out to be a house of cards. I had to mourn him as if he had died, because the man I loved would never have let this happen. The man who stood by and watched was a stranger. I tried to build a routine, a fragile scaffolding to hold up the collapsing structure of my life. Work, grocery store, gym, home, repeat. I joined a book club that met at the local library. The other members were all women in their 60s, widows and grandmothers who smelled of lavender and mothballs. They were kind, in a pitying sort of way. They'd ask me gentle, probing questions about my life back in the city, and I'd give them vague, sanitized answers. They knew I was running from something. They were just too polite to ask what. One evening, about 2 months after I'd arrived, I was in the diner downstairs, picking at a plate of lukewarm meatloaf. The bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in, shaking the dust from his boots. He was tall, with weathered skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He looked like he'd been carved from the very landscape outside. He took a seat at the counter, and the waitress, a cheerful woman named Barb, greeted him by name. "Evening, Ben." He nodded at her, then his eyes met mine. I quickly looked down at my plate, a flush of embarrassment rising in my cheeks. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, the strange city creature on display. A few minutes later, he was standing by my table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice was a low, pleasant rumble. "Counter's full of gossip, and I'm not in the mood for it tonight." I hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair. "Be my guest." He introduced himself as Ben Carter. He was a farmer. His family had been working the land around Prairie Ridge for 4 generations. He told me about the challenges of modern farming, the price of soybeans, the temperamental nature of the weather. He spoke with a quiet passion that was mesmerizing. He didn't ask me where I was from or why I was here. He just talked to me like I was a person, not a curiosity. We started talking regularly after that. Sometimes he'd be at the diner when I went down for dinner. Other times, I'd see him at the hardware store or the post office. Our conversations were easy and unremarkable. We talked about books, movies, the terrible coffee at the office. He had a dry, understated wit that made me laugh, a genuine, booming laugh that felt rusty from disuse. He never once mentioned Mark or my past. It was as if he understood that I was a person who had started her life over from scratch, and he was content to know the version of me that existed now, in this place. With Ben, I wasn't the woman who had been betrayed and discarded. I was just Amelia. One Saturday, he asked if I wanted to see his farm. I agreed, more out of a desire to escape my apartment than anything else. He drove me out in his dusty pickup truck, down a series of gravel roads that seemed to lead to nowhere. But then we crested a small hill, and I saw it. His farmhouse was a simple, white, 2-story building, surrounded by ancient oak trees. Barns and silos stood like sentinels against the sky, and all around, the land rolled out in every direction, a patchwork quilt of green and gold. He gave me a tour. He showed me the massive combine harvester, explaining its complex inner workings with the patience of a born teacher. He introduced me to his dog, a scruffy border collie named Gus, who took an immediate liking to me. He let me collect a still warm egg from the chicken coop. As I stood there, holding the fragile, perfect thing in my palm, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We sat on his porch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The silence here was different from the silence in my apartment. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the gentle sounds of the countryside, the chirping of crickets, the lowing of distant cattle, the rustle of the wind in the cornfields. "It's beautiful," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "It's home," he said simply. He looked at me, his gaze steady and direct. "You know, Amelia, this land, it's tough. It asks a lot of you. The winters are brutal. The summers are scorching. The wind never stops. But it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. You put in the work, you respect it, and it'll give you a place to stand." I knew he wasn't just talking about the land. He was talking about life. He was talking about me. In that moment, sitting on that porch, I realized that Prairie Ridge wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a punchline to a cruel joke. It was a place to stand. It was a place to heal. My phone rang later that night. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Amelia?" The voice was instantly recognizable, even though it had been months. It was Mark. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice colder than I expected. I just wanted to see how you were," he said. He sounded tired. "Listen, Ames, I'm so sorry. I've been doing a lot of thinking. What Chloe did, what I let her do, it was unforgivable. unforgivable. I was a coward. The apology I had fantasized about for months was finally here, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. It just felt empty. Too little, too late. Yes, you were, I said. I miss you, he whispered. I made a mistake. A huge, stupid mistake. Please, can we talk? Can I come see you? I looked out my window at the single blinking traffic light on Main Street. I thought about the life I had left behind, the life I was slowly, painstakingly building here. I thought about Ben's honest eyes and the feel of a warm egg in my hand. I thought about the vast, open sky and the wind that had scoured me clean. No, Mark, I said, and the word was a release. There's nothing left to talk about. I've been transferred. I hung up the phone before he could reply. I blocked his number, and for the first time since that horrible day, I didn't feel anger or grief. I didn't feel anything at all for him. He was a ghost from another life, a story that was already over. My new story was just beginning, here under the wide, honest sky of North Dakota. It wasn't the life I had planned, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like my own. The seasons turned. The vibrant gold of autumn gave way to the stark white of winter. The snow came, and it stayed, blanketing the world in a thick, silent layer of white. The cold was a living thing, a predator that stalked the edges of town. I learned to dress in layers, to plug in my car's block heater, to appreciate the simple, profound pleasure of a warm fire and a hot cup of coffee. The book club ladies taught me how to make a proper hot dish. Ben taught me how to drive on ice. Our friendship deepened into something quiet and steady. There was no grand cinematic romance. It was built in small moments. Him showing up with a snowblower to dig out my car after a blizzard. Me bringing him a thermos of soup when he was working late in his workshop. Long evenings spent playing cribbage by the fire, with Gus snoring at our feet. He was patient. He never pushed, never pried. He simply created a space for me to be, and slowly, I began to inhabit it. One evening, we were sitting on his porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in shimmering curtains of green and purple. It was breathtaking, a silent, celestial ballet. I've never seen anything like it, I whispered, awestruck. You get used to it, he said, but his eyes were fixed on the sky, and I could see the same wonder in them that I felt. But you never stop appreciating it. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the ethereal glow. Amelia, I'm not a complicated man. I know you came here with a lot of baggage. I don't need to know what's in it, but I'd be honored if you'd let me help you carry it for a while. My breath hitched. Tears pricked at my eyes, threatening to freeze on my cheeks. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. It wasn't a promise to fix me or to erase my past. It was an offer of partnership, of simple, sturdy support. It was everything Mark had failed to be. I'd like that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took my hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around mine, and just like that, something shifted. A wall I hadn't even realized I'd built around my heart began to crumble. We sat there for a long time, holding hands, watching the heavens dance, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a vast, terrifying unknown. It felt like a promise. Spring finally arrived, bursting forth with an almost violent energy. The snow melted, the fields turned a vibrant green, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. I felt a similar thawing within myself. The job at the office was still just a job, but it no longer defined my existence. My life was here, in this small town, with these people. I had friends. I had a community. I had Ben. I quit my corporate job in May. It was terrifying and exhilarating. I had no plan, no safety net, but I had a little money saved up from the relocation bonus. The irony was not lost on me, and a burgeoning sense of self-reliance. I started helping Ben on the farm, learning the rhythms of the land, the satisfaction of physical labor, the quiet joy of watching things grow. I also started writing again. It was something I had loved in college, but had abandoned for the security of a steady paycheck. I started a blog about my experiences as a city girl transplanted to the prairie. I wrote about the culture shock, the beauty of the landscape, the quirky characters I'd met. I wrote with honesty and humor, and to my surprise, people started reading it. First a few locals, then people from other small towns, then people from cities who dreamed of a simpler life. One day, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from a small publishing house in Minneapolis. An editor had been following my blog. She loved my voice. She wanted to know if I'd ever considered writing a book. I stared at the email for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding. A book, my own book. It felt impossible. A dream I hadn't even dared to have. I showed the email to Ben, my hands trembling. He read it, and a slow grin spread across his face. He pulled me into a hug, lifting me off the ground and spinning me around. I knew it, he said, his voice filled with a pride that brought fresh tears to my eyes. I always knew you had stories to tell. That summer was a blur of happy, frantic work. I spent my days on the farm, my hands in the soil, and my nights at my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was building two lives at once, one rooted in the earth, the other in the world of words. And I had never felt more alive, more myself. The package arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day I had left the city. It was a thick manila envelope with Mark's return address on it. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But curiosity, that stubborn, persistent human trait, got the better of me. Inside was a stack of letters, all in his familiar, messy scrawl, and tucked within them was a formal-looking document. It was a wedding invitation. Mark was getting married, to a woman I'd never heard of. A bitter, ironic laugh escaped me. He had moved on. Of course he had. I sat down and, against my better judgment, I read the letters. They were a pathetic chronicle of his guilt and regret. He wrote about how empty the apartment felt without me, how he'd finally stood up to Chloe and his family, how he realized too late what he had lost. He wrote that he had met someone new, that she was nice, but that she wasn't me. He wrote that he hoped I was happy. The letters were a desperate, last-ditch attempt at absolution, a plea for me to tell him he was a good man who had made a mistake mistake, but I wasn't interested in absolving him. His actions had set me on a path I never would have chosen for myself, a path of pain and loneliness and reinvention. And that path had led me here, to a life that was richer and more authentic than anything I had ever known with him. I walked out to the burn barrel at the edge of the property, the letters and the invitation in my hand. Ben was there, burning some old papers. He looked at what I was holding, then at my face, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask any questions. I dropped the thick bundle into the flames. We stood together and watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The words of regret, the invitation to a life that was no longer mine, the last vestiges of my past, they all went up in smoke, carried away on the ever-present prairie wind. As the last ember died out, I felt a final, definitive click inside me. The door to that chapter of my life wasn't just closed, it was locked, barred, and sealed. "You okay?" Ben asked softly, putting his arm around my shoulders. I leaned into his warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and soil. I looked out at the endless fields, the vast sky, the simple farmhouse that had become my home. I thought about the book I was writing, the life I was building, the man standing beside me. "I'm better than okay," I said, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was the absolute truth. The prank that was meant to ruin me had, in the end, been the unlikely catalyst for my salvation. They had tried to send me to the middle of nowhere, and instead, I had found the center of everything. My book, Prairie Transplant, was published the following spring. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience. It was reviewed in a few major papers, and I was even invited to a small literary festival in a neighboring state. The day the first hardcover copy arrived, Ben framed it and hung it on the living room wall. His pride was a tangible thing, a warm glow that filled the house. Life settled into a comfortable, happy rhythm. I continued to write, finding endless inspiration in the landscape and the people around me. I worked alongside Ben on the farm, my hands growing calloused, my body strong. We were a team, in every sense of the word. The quiet, steady friendship had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. A love built not on grand gestures or passionate declarations, but on shared work, mutual respect, and the simple comfort of knowing you had a partner to face whatever life threw at you. The folks in Prairie Ridge, who had once viewed me with cautious curiosity, had long since accepted me as one of their own. I was no longer the girl from the city. I was Amelia. I was Ben's partner. I was the woman who wrote the book about their town. I belonged. One afternoon, I was browsing in the town's general store, picking up some supplies, when my old life came crashing back in the most unexpected way. I was reaching for a bag of flour when a voice behind me said my name. "Amelia?" I turned, and my blood ran cold. It was Chloe, Mark's stepsister. She looked older, of course. She was in her late teens now, her face thinner, her eyes carrying a weariness that hadn't been there before. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by a look of hesitant uncertainty. I stared at her, speechless. What in God's name was she doing in Prairie Ridge, North Dakota? "What do you want?" I finally managed to say, my voice sharp and hostile. She flinched. I came to apologize," she stammered, twisting the strap of her purse. "I'm on a road trip with some friends from college. We were passing through, and I saw the sign for the town, and I remembered this is where they sent you. Where you sent me," I corrected her coldly, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered, "where I sent you. It was a horrible thing to do. I was a stupid, jealous kid. I was angry at my dad for remarrying, and I took it out on you because you were an easy target. It was cruel, and I've felt guilty about it ever since." I looked at this young woman, this ghost from my past, standing in the aisle of a general store in the middle of nowhere, offering an apology I had never expected to receive. For years, she had been a villain in my story, a caricature of teenage malice. But the person in front of me was just a person, a flawed, regretful person. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my anger slowly being replaced by a weary confusion. "Because Mark's marriage is falling apart," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He married her on the rebound, and he's miserable. And he blames me. He says I ruined the only good thing he ever had. And my dad and stepmom, things are tense. I guess I wanted to see if you were okay. I needed to see that I hadn't completely destroyed your life." A strange, hollow feeling settled in my stomach. Their family, the one she had been so desperate to protect from me, was fracturing from the inside out. The poison she had injected into my life had eventually seeped back into her own. There was a grim, karmic justice to it, but it brought me no pleasure. It was just sad. I thought about what to say. I could have unleashed years of pent-up rage. I could have told her exactly how much pain she had caused, how her prank had shattered my world. I could have made her cry. But as I looked at her, I realized I didn't want to. Hurting her wouldn't heal me. I was already healed. Her apology, her family's drama, Mark's unhappiness, it was all irrelevant. It was their story, not mine. "I'm fine, Chloe," I said, and my voice was calm and even. "My life is good. I'm happy here." Relief washed over her face. "Oh," she said. "Good. I'm really glad to hear that." An awkward silence fell between us. Her friends were waiting for her outside. She needed to go. "Well," she said, backing away. It was good to see you, Amelia. I'm sorry for everything." She turned and walked out of the store. I watched her go. Then I paid for my flour and walked back out into the bright prairie sunshine. Ben was waiting for me in the truck, Gus in the passenger seat. He saw the look on my face. "Who was that?" he asked. "Just someone I used to know," I said, climbing in beside him. I told him the whole story as we drove back to the farm. He listened patiently, his hand resting on my knee, his knuckles white. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Do you wish you'd said more?" he finally asked. I thought about it. I thought about the perfect, cutting remarks I could have made, the satisfying sting of verbal revenge, and I realized, with a deep and profound certainty, that I didn't. "No," I said. "I've already written the ending to that story. I don't need to add another chapter." He squeezed my knee. "Good," he said, "because our story is a lot more interesting." And he was right. The past was a closed book, gathered gathering dust on a shelf. My future was here, in the passenger seat of this old pickup truck, on this land, under this endless sky. My future was a blank page, and I was the one holding the pen, and I had so many more stories left to write. The encounter with Chloe, unsettling as it was, served a purpose. It was a final confirmation that I had truly moved on. Her apology was for her, not for me. It was an attempt to lighten her own burden of guilt, and I felt a strange sense of pity for her, and for Mark, and for the whole tangled, unhappy mess of a family I had so narrowly escaped. They were trapped in a cycle of blame and regret. While I was free, that freedom became my compass. Ben and I married the following year, not in a church, but in the middle of a wheat field at sunset, surrounded by the small circle of friends who had become our family. Barb from the diner catered, the book club ladies arranged the wildflowers, and a neighbor played the fiddle. It was simple, and it was perfect. Gus was the ring bearer, a small velvet pouch tied around his neck. Our life together was a testament to the beauty of the ordinary. We worked the land, we paid our bills, we weathered storms, both literal and figurative. We had 2 children, a boy with Ben's kind eyes and a girl with my stubborn streak. We raised them to be resilient, to respect the earth, and to understand that home isn't a place you're from, but a place you build. My writing career continued to grow in quiet, unexpected ways. I never became a household name, but I found a loyal readership who appreciated my honest, unvarnished stories about rural life, love, and second chances. I wrote 3 more books, each one digging a little deeper into the soil of my adopted home. I taught a writing workshop at the community college in the next town over, helping others find their own voices. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I would think about the life I might have had, the life in the city, with Mark. I would picture the high-rise apartment, the corporate job, the weekend brunches, the strained holidays with his family. It felt like watching a movie about a stranger. The connection was gone. That woman, the one who would have tolerated being a second-class citizen in her own life, was someone I no longer recognized. The prank, the transfer, the betrayal, they were no longer the defining events of my life. They were simply the catalyst, the violent shove that had pushed me out of a comfortable, compromised existence and into a life of my own making. It was a brutal beginning, but it had led to a beautiful story. One day, when my daughter was about Chloe's age, she came home from school upset. A group of girls had played a mean trick on her, excluding her from a party and then mocking her for it online. My heart ached for her, and a familiar, cold rage stirred in my gut. I held her as she cried, and I told her about bullies and about the casual cruelty people are sometimes capable of. And then, I told her a story. I told her about a woman who had a very bad trick played on her, a trick that took away her job, her home, and the man she thought she loved. I told her how that woman was sent to a place she'd never been, all alone, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. What happened to her? My daughter asked, her eyes wide, her tears forgotten for a moment. She was sad and angry for a long time, I said, but then she decided that she wouldn't let that trick be the end of her story. She decided to write a new one. She made new friends. She found a new job. She fell in love with a handsome farmer. I poked Ben, who was listening from the doorway, and he winked. She built a new home, and she discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can end up being the best thing because it pushes you to find the life you were really meant to have. My daughter looked at me, then at Ben, then around the warm, cluttered living room of our farmhouse. Is that woman you? She asked. I smiled and kissed the top of her head. Yes, honey, it's me. In that moment, telling my own story to my child, I understood its true meaning. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't a tale of revenge. It was a story of resilience. It was about the incredible, stubborn, and beautiful human capacity to take the broken pieces of a life and build something stronger, something better, in its place. I never heard from Mark or his family again. For all I know, they are still living their lives, caught in the orbits of their own making. I hope they found some measure of peace, but their story is no longer my concern. My world is here, circumscribed by the horizon, filled with the love of my family, the satisfaction of my work, and the constant, comforting whisper of the prairie wind. A wind that once sounded like loneliness, but now sounds like home. Years later, after the kids had gone off to college and Ben and I were settling into the comfortable quiet of an empty nest, I received an official-looking letter from my old company. They were celebrating a major anniversary and were reaching out to former employees to contribute to a commemorative digital archive. They were asking for a short paragraph about a memorable moment from our time with the company. I sat at my desk, looking out the window at the fields, now dusted with the first snow of the season. A memorable moment. I could write about the day I got promoted, or the big project I successfully managed, but that felt dishonest. There was only one truly memorable moment, one that had irrevocably altered the course of my life. I opened my laptop and began to type. My most memorable moment, I wrote, was the day I was transferred to the Prairie Ridge branch in North Dakota. It was an unexpected move, initiated on my behalf under unusual circumstances. I arrived knowing no one, believing my career and my life were in ruins, but that transfer, which at the time felt like a cruel joke, turned out to be the single greatest gift I have ever received. It taught me that a life isn't something that happens to you, it's something you build. It gave me a community, a family, and a home. It was, without a doubt, the best prank anyone has ever played on me. I hit send without a moment's hesitation. It was the truth, my truth, and it was a story I was no longer afraid to tell. The legacy of that prank continued to ripple through my life in the most unexpected of ways. The local newspaper did a feature story on me and the farm after my third book was published. The journalist was fascinated by the story of how I ended up in Prairie Ridge. I gave her the sanitized version, of course, focusing on the theme of reinvention rather than the grimy details of the betrayal. The article was syndicated and picked up by a few regional papers. A few weeks after it ran, I got an email with the subject line, "Are you the the Amelia from the article? It was from a woman named Sarah. She had worked at the same company as me, in a different department. She wrote that she had been the one to fill my old position after I was so abruptly transferred. She said my sudden departure had always been a bit of a mystery, whispered about in the office as a strange, impulsive decision. She told me she had worked there for another 2 years before leaving. She also told me something that made me stop and reread the email twice. Mark had been fired about 6 months after I left. There had been an internal investigation. It turned out he had been letting Chloe use his company login credentials, not just for the prank on me, but for other things as well. She had been accessing confidential company files, reading employee emails, and generally causing low-level chaos. The transfer application she submitted for me was just the one thing that had real-world consequences and brought the whole issue to light. Mark was fired for gross negligence and a severe breach of company security protocols. Reading that email felt like finding the last missing piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving. It didn't change anything for me, not really, but it provided a satisfying, if belated, sense of consequence. Mark's weakness, his passive refusal to set boundaries, hadn't just cost him me, it had cost him his job. His inaction had its own karmic price tag. I wrote back to Sarah, thanking her for the information, and we exchanged a few pleasant emails before drifting back into our separate lives. But knowing that small detail settled something deep inside me, the universe, it seemed, did have a way of balancing its books. Ben and I grew older. The lines on our faces deepened. Our hair turned silver at the temples. The work on the farm got harder, but our partnership only grew stronger. We leased some of our land to a younger farming family, keeping just enough for a large garden and some chickens. Our days became quieter, filled with the simple pleasures of reading on the porch, taking long walks with Gus's descendant, a cheerful collie named Pip, and watching our grandchildren chase fireflies in the yard during their summer visits. My writing became more reflective. I wrote less about the novelty of my transplant and more about the deeper currents of life, the changing of seasons, the cycle of birth and death on a farm, the quiet endurance of love over time. My books were my legacy, a chronicle of a life I had never expected, lived in a place I had never intended to be. One crisp autumn day, Ben and I were cleaning out the attic, a task we'd been putting off for years. Amidst dusty boxes of old clothes and children's toys, I found a small box labeled "From Before." It was one of the boxes I had shipped from the city all those years ago. Inside were a few mementos from my old life, college yearbooks, concert ticket stubs, and at the very bottom, a framed photo of me and Mark. We looked so young. We were standing on a beach, squinting into the sun, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with a naive, unburdened happiness. I felt a faint echo of the woman I had been, a ghost of the love I had felt. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a distant, detached sort of sadness for the two young people in the picture and the future they thought they had. "Who's that?" Ben asked, peering over my shoulder. "That's him," I said quietly, "the one who called it a prank." Ben studied the photo for a long moment. He didn't say anything dismissive or cruel. He just nodded slowly. "He looks like a boy," he said, "and he let a girl make a decision for him." It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. He did. I agreed. I looked from the smiling boy in the photograph to the gray-haired man standing beside me, his hand resting gently on my back, the man who had shown me what real strength and partnership looked like. The contrast was stark, and it filled me with a profound sense of gratitude. I took the photo out of the frame, tore the picture into 4 neat pieces, and dropped them into the trash bag. It wasn't a dramatic gesture of rage. It was a simple act of housekeeping, of clearing out something that no longer had a place in my home. Life, I had learned, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it. The betrayal was part of my story. It was the dark, fertile soil from which my new life had grown. Without it, I would never have found this place. I would never have found Ben. I would never have found myself. As we finished cleaning, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields. We stood at the attic window, looking out at the familiar landscape. The sky was a brilliant canvas of orange, pink, and purple, the same spectacular show it put on every evening. I still hadn't gotten used to it, and I still appreciated it. "You know," I said, leaning my head on Ben's shoulder, "I was thinking about that company archive, about what I wrote. Yeah? I think I finally understand it now. It really was the best prank ever played, because the punchline wasn't that I ended up in North Dakota. The punchline was that I ended up happy." Ben smiled, his arm tightening around me. "Best punchline I've ever heard," he said. We stood there until the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The prairie wind picked up, rattling the old window frame, a sound as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. It was the sound of my life, the soundtrack to my unexpected, hard-won, and beautiful story. A story that started with a malicious joke and ended with a quiet, unshakable peace. It was more than I ever could have asked for. It was everything.